feel like everything about my life is really up to me. And if I don't make it happen, it's not going to happen. Anything worth doing well is worth me doing it myself. We get this mindset that it's really all about me. Now, some of us have coped with this quite well by using apathy and laziness. Some of us have just said, I don't care if the thing gets done, or I don't want to put out the effort, and I'm gonna cope with it that way. But the majority of us allow it to weigh on us. And so I'm not going to talk about the apathy and laziness side of things today. I'm going to talk about sort of the workaholic perfectionist side of things that all of us have at some level of our lives where we say there's more that I have to do. And I was trying to come up with some terminology, some words that would really describe this, that would really encapsulate it. And the best I could come up with this phrase, self-reliance. And so that's why the title of this message is called Self-Reliance, and that's why the next section on your note sheet there is called Self-Reliance. We're going to deal with some of that. Because what we're doing is we're basically saying, I have to rely on myself. There's no one else I can rely on. Still tracking with me? So, before we get to our command, there's one last thing I have to do, and I have to show you what the dangers and what the results of self-reliance are. And here they are. The first one is dissatisfaction. Dissatisfaction. See, what happens is we set up this perfection idea as our goal, and we all know that perfection doesn't exist. We all know that the perfect reality of your money and your finances does not exist, but there's always more that can be done. It could always be better. And so we get this sense of dissatisfaction. Now, dissatisfaction all by itself is not a bad thing. Self-reliance, in fact, all by itself is not necessarily a bad thing. You and I expect each other to be self-reliant over certain aspects of our lives. I sort of expect that you, as a mature individual, can be self-reliant over your own ability to dress yourself. I don't want to come over to your house and have to dress you. I sort of rely on the fact that you can handle that by yourself. And so that's self-reliant at its good thing. But this attitude can be meshed with dissatisfaction, and it produces some really nasty, disgusting, gross things. See, if I look at the world around me and I say, I'm dissatisfied with that, but I have a sense of self-reliance, then what I'm going to say next is, I have to fix it, but I haven't fixed it. And so then the next result is guilt. The next thing is guilt. There we go. See, what that says is, I didn't get it, and now I feel bad about it. But see, here's the deal. If you're relying completely on yourself and you feel guilty, there's only one thing left to do. Because it's hard for us to forgive ourselves, right? Because if I feel guilty about something, I want to make it right. If someone outside me says you're forgiven, then I can say, okay, maybe I am forgiven. But if I myself am feeling guilty about something, I have to make it right. And the only way to make it right is to do better. And so the next result of self-reliance, when it mixes with guilt, is what I would call legalism. This idea that everything I have to do has to fall under this code of ethics that I'm going to create for myself. So you've got dissatisfaction leading to guilt, then leading to legalism, where I simply say, I'm going to set up a rule of conduct for myself, and I'm going to follow that thing. And then every time I mess up, I'm going to feel more guilty, I'm going to create more rules, and I'm going to go back in this cycle over and over again. And that cycle, as lived out in your life, results in one final thing, and that's slavery. The last thing is that we become slaves to our own standards. We become slaves to our own dissatisfaction. We become slaves to a world around us that seems to be pressing in on us their desires, and we're trying to please them and all these things. And so you've got this massive chain of events, this chain reaction thing that begins with something so seemingly inconsequential as my self-reliance, an attitude that I have to rely on only myself, but it leads ultimately to a sense of slavery. I thought I was free, I thought I was independent, but I end up being a slave. God doesn't want you to be a slave. In fact, there's a command in the Bible where God declares to you that you need to let go. You need to not do some things. You need to take one day out of every week and just simply say, I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to keep up with the rat race on this day. I'm going to let go. I'm going to release it. I'm just not going to work or to worry or to take it upon myself to accomplish these things. If you've got the Bible there, turn to Exodus chapter 20. It's on page 53 in the Bibles we passed out. Exodus chapter 20. We're going to look at a command here that, like I said before, is command number 2, and command number 4, and it's the one that we often reject. Exodus chapter 20, beginning in verse 8. Here we go. God says through Moses, "Remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, neither you, nor your son or daughter, nor your manservant or maidservant, nor your animals, nor the alien within your gates. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea, and all that is in them. But he rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy." Now, this is very fascinating because this is the command that God gives us that's the longest of all the commands. There are other commands like don't murder, That's a pretty important command, but God says I only need to put one tiny little sentence in there about the whole murdering thing. But about this one, about this Sabbath thing, he's got to give us a long series of explanations about it. In fact, when we get to Deuteronomy later on this morning, we're going to see that God gives a completely different reason for the same command in the Deuteronomy passage. It's the only command that God gives two completely separate reasons for why we should keep it. It's almost as if God knew it would be hard for us. It's almost as if he knew this is the one we'd want to ignore the most. And so what usually happens is that people look at this command and they've got two general approaches to it. One approach is to say, okay, tell me specifically what I can and can't do. What are the things on the Sabbath that I'm allowed to do? The Jewish people did this for centuries. When I lived in Chicago, it was very fascinating that when we first moved to town, we noticed around these light poles, there were wires attached to the light poles. And they weren't electrical wires, they were just wires up there. And it seemed like they were marking off blocks of houses. And we asked someone about it, and they told us that those wires around the light poles are to let the Jewish people know how far they're allowed to walk on the Sabbath day. You can't cross those wires, because if you cross those wires, that's work. But you can walk around your neighborhood, and that's okay. And that's just part of the culture that Judaism developed over the centuries that said, basically, we need to understand what we can and what we can't do, and you and I do the same thing. Give me the rules, give me the explicit rules. And so God says, okay, I'll tell you, don't do any work. Don't let anyone near you do any work. Don't let your servants do any work. Don't let your animals do any work. Don't let strangers do any work. Don't do any work. So just don't do any work. So if